Oh, it's 2020, and we're talking about Frank Gore and Marshawn Lynch. That's right. Welcome to Fantasy Football Today. I'm Jamie, that's Heath, that's Dave, and making his debut on Fantasy Football Today on CBS Sports HQ. It's Ben Gretsch. Ben, thanks for joining us today. Heath, Dave, same thing. And let's talk about some old running backs before we get into the meat of our show, which is going to be quarterbacks and tight ends. We're going to break down our rankings and things that have changed following the NFL draft. But let's start with the news. Frank Gore signing with the Jets, staying in the state of New York, and he goes from the Bills, where he was the starter, eventually became the backup to Devin Singletary, to now the backup to Le'Veon Bell. So, Ben, when you look at Le'Veon Bell, that's really the story here. What's the impact?
Yeah, I already thought Le'Veon Bell was maybe ranked a little bit too high, so I think this is just another reason not to like him. We know that Adam Gase's offenses over the last several years have not been very productive for fantasy players at any position, but especially running backs. And I have been concerned about Le'Veon Bell's ability to improve on some really bad efficiency numbers. We typically see regression at levels where he was at, but I just don't know if we're going to see that in this offense. And then now you add in Frank Gore, potential for some goal line vultures. It's a tough fit for me.
Adam Gase has said that he wants to lighten the workload for Bell. Dave, when you look at this situation, same thing. How much are you concerned now about Le'Veon Bell, and do you have to take maybe Frank Gore as a handcuff?
Well, first things first, I had to check my calendar and make sure it wasn't 2016 or something like that when this signing happened, and it's not, and that's great. It makes me want to pass on all Jets. Right, seriously. Look, I think that Frank Gore being there is going to be a problem. I don't think anybody should draft Frank Gore, handcuff or not, to Le'Veon Bell. Maybe if you're in a deeper league and you want to just you wait to get Le'Veon Bell and you want to safeguard him, I don't know if this even makes sense. But getting Frank Gore then, you could do it. But I don't think Frank Gore is going to be a stat machine. And the problem is I don't think Le'Veon Bell is going to be much of a stat machine either. Number 2 fantasy running back in PPR at best.
Keith, you've been the high guy on Le'Veon all offseason. Same thing. How much does this maybe concern you? And then give me the dynasty spin on LaMichael Pirine, who the Jets did draft and maybe looked as if he was going to be the number 2 guy. Do you have to even spend a pick on him in rookie drafts?
I just saw today that I believe LaMichael Pirine was 7 years old when Frank Gore entered the NFL. This should not matter at all. Frank Gore hasn't actually been good for like 3 or 4 years. But unfortunately, the last time we saw Frank Gore and Adam Gase on the same team, he was giving Frank Gore more carries than consensus top 12 running back now, Kenyon Drake. So you have to be at least somewhat concerned. I would still take Pirine with a third-round rookie pick, late third-round rookie pick. I don't really want to draft Gore as any sort of handcuff because I think his best case scenario, if Bell goes down, is he's getting the unproductive part of that workload. He's taking the early downs work and someone else they're throwing the ball to. And really the only chance you have to be good, and the reason that I do still have some faith in Bell, is that there should be plenty of pass attempts to go to the running backs in this offense. He did plenty in that regard last year. I don't think Gore is going to take receptions away from Bell. This adds a little bit more risk because Gore could steal some touchdowns. I still like him as a high-end number 2, not a low-end number 2, but as a high-end number 2 in PPR. But I thought he was a number 1 before this.
Yep, just another complicated backfield that we have to deal with now with Frank Gore going to the Jets. And one more backfield that could become a little bit more complicated is the one in Seattle, where reports on Monday night were that Marshawn Lynch's agent talking to the Seahawks. And so we could be looking at another reunion with Lynch in Seattle. He played in 3 games for them last year, 1 in the regular season, 2 in the playoffs, and Lynch scored 4 touchdowns in those 3 games. And so, Keith, when you look at Lynch, again, this really isn't about him going to Seattle. It's more about the guy that we've been drafting a lot, and that's Chris Carson coming back from the hip injury. He's expected to be ready for week 1. We're still waiting to find out what the status is going to be with Rashad Penny coming back from his ACL tear. Reports are he could potentially start on the PUP list. And then you have DJ Dallas, who they drafted. So looking at Chris Carson, is this another indication that maybe Carson not headed for the workload that we hope, because there could be more mouths to feed in the Seattle backfield?
Possibly, but the nice thing for Carson is he doesn't really have to get a huge workload in the Seattle offense that should be one of the better rushing offenses in football. So I do think that he could weather this and still be a top 20 running back, but it would certainly be annoying. It would negatively affect DJ Dallas. It would probably signal very strongly they don't think Rashad Penny is going to be ready for the start of the year. So they would need 3 running backs anyway. I'm still fine with Carson as a number 2, even if Lynch signs.
Ben, we spend time on our podcast on Monday. You can find our podcast, Fantasy Football Today, wherever podcasts are found. That's our shameless plug here. Ben, we spent some time talking about Rashad Penny. You said you still look at him as the second best running back in Seattle. If they do bring in Marshawn Lynch, is this really just an indication that you probably want to avoid Penny in the late round pick?
Yeah, I think Lynch, it's very similar to Gore in my mind, that Lynch would come in and be a potential touchdown vulture. That's how they used him late last year. He's always been a very physical back. They're not going to use him every down and at all areas of the field, but they're going to use him to pound at the goal line, and that's going to hold down touchdowns for the rest of the running backs. And yeah, Penny's path was always a little bit thin, and he was trying to work into at least a committee at best. And now if you have a kind of a designated goal line type presence there, it's definitely makes his path to relevance a lot thinner.
Dave, where are you drafting Chris Carson? And then the same thing about Michael P. Ryan in Dynasty. What does this mean for DJ Dallas in Dynasty? Is he somebody that people should still take a look at, or maybe somebody you want to pass on?
You could still take Dallas in like round 3 or round 4 in rookie-only drafts, but that's about it, because who knows how much of an opportunity he'll get if Marshawn Lynch is there. And I'm already assuming that Marshawn Lynch is going to be there. The cat's already out of the bag. And there's 2 things I think about with Marshawn Lynch. Number one, he's kind of like the touchdown vulture mascot of the Seattle Seahawks. They want to use him there. It gets the team fired up. And number 2, it's the quarantine storyline. Marshawn knows what he's doing. DJ Dallas isn't going to know exactly what he's doing when the Seahawks open camp. Seattle wants to have players who can get up to speed really quickly so that they can be successful on the field. Lynch knows what he's doing. I think Chris Carson is still going to be right around 45th overall on draft day. But Marshawn Lynch is going to make an appearance in drafts unlike Frank Gore. You'll see him in the late rounds.
Okay, just to be clear, Marshawn Lynch has not signed with Seattle yet. Frank Gore has signed with the Jets, so that transaction is official. We're still waiting to find out if Lynch will be part of the Seahawks roster. We do know, though, that quarterbacks and the rosters that they are on, and we're going to take a look now at our quarterback rankings. This is the consensus rankings that we're looking at for CBSSports.com. This is myself, Heath, and Dave. Ben's rankings are going to be worked in. He has sent me his rankings, so we will touch on those as well. So these are the consensus rankings of all 3 of us. And as you see here, Patrick Mahomes, Lamar Jackson, Dak Prescott, Russell Wilson. If you look at our rankings, Ben's as well, those are the top 4 for all of us. So we are completely in agreement with the top 4 quarterbacks. And so, Heath, I want to ask you the question about a guy clearly you're in favor of if everybody takes a look behind your head with the Chiefs football. Patrick Mahomes over Lamar Jackson. Last year, Jackson better than Mahomes. Clearly, he was the NFL MVP. He was actually better than what Jackson was better in 2019 than what Mahomes did in 2018. But again, we're all saying Mahomes over Jackson. Tell us why.
All of the reasons that we told you not to draft Patrick Mahomes in the first round last year apply to Lamar Jackson this year. His passing production, just specifically, forget about the running for a second. The passing production, out of this world efficiency, and there's simply no way he's going to match that. The touchdown rate's going to collapse. The yards per attempt's going to collapse, just like it did with Mahomes last year. So he's going to lose that. And then you also have the additional risk with a quarterback that runs as often as he did. For one thing, he's probably not going to run as much as he did. The J.K. Dobbins pick may have told us that. They want more running backs and less running from Jackson. But also, he's much more likely to suffer a significant injury. We saw Mahomes get dinged up last year. Jackson's injury risk higher than Mahomes is. So I just feel more confident in what Mahomes' floor is and what his ceiling is in terms of realistic.
Since 2012, there has been no quarterback to repeat number 1 year over year. The last guy to do it was Drew Brees, 2011, 2012. And you referenced the rushing numbers. Since 2010, there have been 24 quarterbacks to run for 500 or more yards. Throw out the 3 guys who did it last year, Lamar Jackson, Kyler Murray, and Josh Allen. So the other 21, only 6 have seen their yards go up the next year. Hard to expect Lamar Jackson's yards to go up even if he's great, because he just set a record with over 1,200 rushing yards. But still, history tells us rushing yards for quarterbacks declines year over year, and the probability of him repeating as the number 1 quarterback, not likely. Ben, I want to ask you about Dak Prescott, because he's got a whole new set of receivers here. No Randall Cobb, no Jason Witten, adding CeeDee Lamb. Blake Jarwin now going to be the tight end, and the 2 guys on the outside remain the same, in Amari Cooper and Michael Gallup. How close is Dak to the 2 guys ahead of him in terms of Mahomes and Jackson?
Well, I think a baseline expectation is still a little ways off, but I do think he has the type of statistical profile that, if Mahomes or Jackson didn't have a peak season and were a little bit more reasonable with their production, that Prescott could challenge them. In fantasy, we're looking for more vertical passing games, and that's what we saw last year with Kellen Moore taking over as the offensive coordinator. They pushed the ball down the field more. Dak set career highs across the board in all of his passing stats. We know he has the rushing ability as well, which is huge, as Heath just mentioned. And his rushing touchdowns and yards are actually down a little bit last year. I think he could come back a little bit from that and add a little bit more rushing yardage and rushing a couple more rushing scores based on what he did in 2019. So yeah, I think Prescott, as long as he's continuing to push it vertically now with CeeDee Lamb in that offense, he already had Amari Cooper and Michael Gallup, two really good downfield receivers. There's a ton of statistical upside for sure in this offense.
Dave, Russell Wilson, somebody we've been talking about this offseason. He's basically begging the Seahawks coaching staff to throw the ball more, open up the offense a little bit. Maybe bringing in Marshawn Lynch, if that happens, could put a negative spin on that. Obviously drafting DJ Dallas. They didn't really add a lot to their wide receiver core. Only Greg Olsen brought in at the tight end position of significance. I'm not going to count Philip Dorsett as anybody of significance. But you look at Russell Wilson, if he does get the ability to throw the ball more, we know he's going to rush a little bit, not the same running quarterback that he has been. Could he maybe jump over any of the three guys in front of him before we get to draft day that we're telling people, draft Wilson ahead of Prescott, maybe draft Wilson ahead of either Jackson or Mahomes?
Well, first of all, Philip Dorsett's going to get like 4 touchdowns, so don't rule out the former Miami Hurricane. And could he jump over those guys? Maybe. He could potentially jump over Dak if Dak takes a big step back from last year. Dak had a really good year in 2019. And Lamar Jackson, you talked about it. It's unlikely that his rushing yards are going to go up. And we've seen a lot of quarterbacks that throw for over 3,000 yards and run for 500 yards in the same season regress the following year. So the case could be made that Russell Wilson could be a top 3 fantasy quarterback. And guess what? That's where he finished last year. I'm concerned about the Seattle defense playing well. I think that could lead to high-scoring games, especially in the NFC West. And that could lead to Russell Wilson attempting a bunch of passes. We already know he's pretty efficient. The numbers are going to come, over 4,000 yards and 30 touchdowns. He's one of the best picks you can make on draft day.
All right, so like I said, the 4 guys at the top are locked in for all 4 of us. Mahomes, Jackson, Prescott, Wilson. Number 5 is where we start to split a little bit. So Ben and Dave both have Kyler Murray at number 5. So Dave, you've been talking about Kyler Murray. We all love him as a potential breakout candidate this year. I'll give you the first word. Why Kyler at 5?
Well, Kyler was originally 3 for me, and then CeeDee Lamb went to Dallas, so then he was 4. And then I thought about Russell Wilson and his safety blanket of what I said, 4,000 yards, 30 touchdowns. And I don't think that Kyler can quite get that. We haven't had a quarterback ever in the NFL have over 500 yards rushing and 4,000 yards passing and 5 rushing touchdowns and over 25 passing touchdowns. That would be an anomaly. I can't count on that. But what I can count on is him getting better in his second season with a new red zone weapon in DeAndre Hopkins, an improved offensive line, and an offensive system that should be going back a little bit toward what they thought they would do at this time last year, which is spread defenses out with a lot of receivers and throw a lot of passes and go with the no huddle. And if that happens, Kyler Murray's numbers are going to be outstanding. He also has a chance to finish as a top 3 fantasy quarterback.
All right, Heath and I both have Deshaun Watson at 5, but we all have Kyler Murray at least in our top 7. So we are telling you that Murray has a chance to be a potential star this year now that he does have DeAndre Hopkins. Hopefully he'll still run a little bit. I want to get into Josh Allen versus some of these older quarterbacks because we're looking at another breakout candidate in Allen now entering his 3rd year with the Bills, and you're comparing him really to the class of quarterbacks that we've been talking about for years as the best of the best. You're looking at Drew Brees, Tom Brady now in Tampa Bay, Matt Ryan in Atlanta. He's obviously put up a lot of great fantasy production. And so when you look at these guys, Ben, comparatively to Josh Allen, why is Allen a better fantasy pick than those older quarterbacks?
Yeah, it's all the rushing upside. I mean, you just mentioned it. He ran for over 500 yards last year. He has, I believe, 9 and 8 rushing touchdowns in his 2 seasons. He's very similar to Cam Newton in that way, the way that he is going to take such a high percentage of their offensive touchdowns. I mean, he's had over a quarter of their total offensive touchdowns each of his 2 seasons just in looking at his rushing scores. That can certainly regress, and I actually kind of expect it will. I don't think that he's going to necessarily run for 8 or 9 touchdowns every year of his career, but that definitely gives him a lot more upside. And when you look at taking quarterbacks in this range, I think you need to look at guys who have the potential to be legitimate top 3 or top 5 options. I still have issues with Allen's accuracy and passing upside, but I do think that rushing ability pushes him ahead of some of those older options.
Heath, I want you to make the case for Brady. Obviously, we're a lot of attention, a lot of buzz with him going to Tampa Bay, playing in the offense that just produced over 5,000 passing yards and 30-plus touchdowns, 30 interceptions as well, but that's a Jameis Winston problem, not a Tom Brady problem. He steps into a lot of great weapons. He gets Rob Gronkowski. How good can Brady be?
Oh, man, it's pretty easy to make the case for him. You just say Chris Godwin, Mike Evans, Rob Gronkowski, and Bruce Arians. Most quarterbacks would be top 12 fantasy quarterbacks with those weapons. And I do think that there is an excellent opportunity here for him to go over 600 pass attempts. I don't think they'll throw it quite as much as they did the year before. If he's anywhere close to 8 yards per attempt, you're over 4,500 yards. Should pretty easily get to 30 touchdowns, I think. I mean, he's got a chance to be a top 4 or 5 fantasy quarterback. There's just a little bit of risk, as Dave mentioned, the quarantine rules over this offseason of him getting on the same page as Godwin, as Arians, most importantly, as Mike Evans, and then throwing the ball downfield more than we've seen him do it in New England. I'm not saying for sure that Tom Brady can't throw the ball downfield. The few times he did it in New England, he did it okay, but he's going to do it a lot more often in Tampa Bay, and we don't know for sure how that's going to look. I would expect he won't have 30 interceptions like Jameis Winston did. He's going to have a lot more than he did his last 2 years in New England.
Come on, he's had that playbook for weeks. He's walking to different people's houses trying to get to Byron Leftwich. He's got that playbook. Gronk's got that playbook. They're going to be just fine, quarantine or not. Before we move on to end the first segment here, I want to look at the top 12 guys again because there's a name that might be a little bit surprising, and that's Matthew Stafford. Now, we like Matthew Stafford, but Ben loves Matthew Stafford. So, Ben, give me your take on Stafford going into a year where he's coming off back injury, didn't play the final 8 games of the season. On a point-per-game basis, he was number 2. How good could he be this year?
Yeah, I mean, last year his per-game stats looked a lot better than they have for several seasons, and he was on pace. He played 8 games. He threw for, I think, 2,499 yards, essentially 2,500 yards. He's basically on pace for a 5,000-yard passing season and very close to 40 touchdowns. That's incredible, and that's not – I think there's a reason to be skeptical that he can repeat that, but the big thing you'll hear me repeat time and again with quarterback upside is whether they're pushing the ball down the field. We talked about it with Dak. You just mentioned Jameis Winston's big numbers in Tampa Bay, and he was a great fantasy quarterback, even with 30 interceptions last year. Stafford's average throw depth, how far downfield he was pushing the ball, was up over 10 yards per attempt last year in Darrell Bevell's new offense. It was 8 yards or lower every other season going all the way back to 2013. So a fundamental difference in how he was pushing the ball down the field last year really led to that big spike in numbers. And he's got all the same guys back. He's got Kenny Golladay and Marvin Jones back. They've actually added a little bit of weaponry with Quintez Cephas as a potential slot option, and then T.J. Hawkinson I think can take a step forward in year 2. So as long as he stays healthy, he's going to be pushing it down the field. I feel really good about his potential to put up big pass yardage numbers.
Yep, could be a lot of shootouts too. Defense may have gotten a little bit worse, and we'll see if DeAndre Swift's also a factor in the passing game as well. There was a name missing from that list, Aaron Rodgers. We're going to tell you about Aaron Rodgers, where he is for the quarterback rankings for 2020, as well as some guys who hopefully owe us a little bit after what they did last season. We're looking at guys like Jared Goff, was a disappointment in 2019. What about Daniel Jones? We'll tell you about the fantasy value for those guys next here on CBS Sports HQ. Welcome back to Fantasy Football. Today, we're talking quarterback rankings here, looking at what the NFL draft has done to our rankings and some of the free agent moves as well. And as we looked at the top 12 guys, there was a name that might have been missing. Let's show you now rankings 13 through 24. These are our consensus rankings, which is basically a combination of myself, Dave, and Heath. We have Ben Gretch's rankings as well that we're working off of, so I will mix that in as part of our conversations here. And so when you see Aaron Rodgers at 13, it's probably a little bit of a surprise. If you look at Dave Richards' rankings, however, you're going to see Aaron Rodgers behind Joe Burrow, make an argument for that, Daniel Jones, Ryan Tannehill, and Drew Lock. All right, Dave, all those guys over Aaron Rodgers?
Yep, they have more upside than Aaron Rodgers. And it's crazy because you think of Aaron Rodgers and you think Hall of Famer, Super Bowl winner, and all that stuff is true. He's going in the Hall of Fame. But when you think of the Packers, you think now that they're more of a running team, and they proved it in the draft, just what they want to do. They found a replacement for Rodgers and Jordan Love. That's down the line. I think A.J. Dillon's going to be a big factor in their offense. I think they want to keep running the football, and they were already doing it going into last year. They scored 21 touchdowns with their running backs inside the 10. Aaron Rodgers threw only 19 touchdowns from inside the 10. His completion percentage has been dropping. His passes haven't been quite as good. He was 15th in consistency among quarterbacks last year, and he tied up about 28% of his total fantasy production in 2 games. And there will be games, it'll probably come against the Bears or Lions, where he has monster efforts, but he won't be consistent, and he doesn't have the upside that those other quarterbacks have. And when you get to that late part of your draft, you're looking for those high upside quarterbacks so you can catch the next Lamar Jackson, the next Patrick Mahomes. Those quarterbacks that I have ranked ahead of Aaron Rodgers have a better chance of finishing in the top 5 than Aaron Rodgers does.
All right, you say the Packers want to be a running team. I think Ryan Tannehill is part of a running team as well. All right, Keith, tell him why he's wrong, that those guys should not be ahead of Aaron Rodgers.
I don't even want to. I'm just enjoying so much that I'm not the guy with the weird ranking. It's a lot of fun when it's you, Dave, so thank you. I think a lot of the points that Dave made about them wanting to be a running team, about, like, even Rodgers' efficiency hasn't really been elite for 3 or 4 years. But I can't make an argument for putting Rodgers behind Ryan Tannehill, who has absolutely zero chance of repeating his efficiency. I mean, we talked at the beginning of the show about how Lamar Jackson has to regress. We're going to change the definition for regression after this season to Ryan Tannehill in the dictionary, because there's no chance on his pass volume, which will be lower than Rodgers, that he's going to be better than Rodgers this year. I worry about Burrow. What have we seen from rookie quarterbacks lately, other than the guys that are going to run for 500 yards, that make us think that he's going to be a top 12 quarterback, much less have top 5 upside? And then Drew Lock won a few games last year and does have some good weapons, but I've not seen enough from Lock to put him anywhere close to my top 12.
All right, Ben, I'm putting you in the judge and jury seat. Break the tie. Heath is not going with those guys over Rodgers. Dave is sticking to his guns and taking those guys over Rodgers. Where are you going on with this with Aaron Rodgers debate?
Well, it's funny because I'm gonna kind of take both guys' sides. I don't have Rodgers ranked ahead of or behind those guys.
Not allowed. You're not allowed. You're not allowed.
I don't have him ranked behind those guys. So I'll take Rodgers over those guys. But I also
there's the answer.
What's that? I also won't be.
There's the answer. Rodgers. You don't have him ranked ahead of those guys.
Yeah, but I also won't be drafting Rodgers in a lot of leagues. I think the underrated element for him is his rushing upside. It's not there anymore. It was a big part of why he was a great fantasy quarterback a half decade ago. He doesn't run a lot anymore. And you couple that with everything they just mentioned about his passing upside no longer being there and the pass attempts not being there. I don't see how he could be anywhere near a top 5 quarterback in fantasy. He doesn't have that kind of upside. Then to me, he's just not really worth a draft pick where you might have to take him.
He's got to settle for. I will definitely agree on that, but I'm not taking Drew Lock, Ryan Tannehill, Daniel Jones ahead of Aaron Rodgers yet. Dave, I'm sorry. I'm not with you there. All right, let's look at Jared Goff, Baker Mayfield, and Ben Roethlisberger, 3 guys who let us down last year, and let's talk about what their fantasy outlook could be for this year. So, Ben, when you look at these 3 guys, is there bounce back potential for any of them, and who's your favorite of that trio?
Sorry, what was the trio? Jared
Goff, Baker Mayfield, and Ben Roethlisberger.
I like Ben Roethlisberger the most of that group. I mean, I think we are a little bit concerned about his elbow, obviously, but I really like what Pittsburgh has at wide receiver now. I mean, Juju Smith-Schuster was banged up last year. We got to be a little bit concerned about that. But while he missed time, Deontay Johnson and James Washington both really came on strong last year. They added Chase Claypool in the draft. They added Eric Ebron in the offseason. So they have all sorts of weaponry now. We don't know if the elbow is going to hold up, but if it does, at least as far back as 2018, 2017, the last few times Ben Roethlisberger's been healthy, we can usually expect a lot of passing in this offense. I think there's plenty of upside with those weapons.
Heath, compare these guys to some of the guys that Dave likes a lot. Joe Burrow, Daniel Jones. We could throw Gardner Minshew in there as well. How does sort of those guys, Goff, Baker, and Roethlisberger, stack up to some of the younger guys, first and second year quarterbacks that we're seeing going into 2020?
I think I have Goff and Roethlisberger both ranked ahead of all of those other guys that you mentioned, except for Gardner Minshew, of course. And the thing that I really like about both Goff and Roethlisberger is the fact that it's not hard at all to imagine those guys getting to 600 pass attempts. In fact, that might be the plan that their team goes into the offseason with. In terms of Baker Mayfield, he's kind of what we expect to be in a situation kind of like Aaron Rodgers and like Tannehill and maybe like Locke. We don't know for sure, but I would anticipate the plan is going to be for the Browns to be as run heavy as their defense will allow. They went and traded for a fullback. They signed a tight end. They've got Nick Chubb and Kareem Hunt. Kevin Stefanski called like 450 passes last year. It won't be that low, but Cleveland definitely going to be a run heavy team. And I'm just not sure that Mayfield's good enough to be a good fantasy quarterback, because you've got to be elite if you're throwing the ball less than 520 times.
So, Dave, you like a couple of sophomores in Daniel Jones and Drew Lock. You like the rookie, the number 1 overall pick, in Joe Burrow. Give me the outlook for the Dolphins and the Chargers, the other teams that took quarterbacks in the top 10 of the 2020 NFL draft. Start with Miami. What's going to be the expectation there for Tua? And same thing with the Chargers for Herbert.
Well, the biggest problem with both of them is that there's probably going to be a quarterback change midway through the season, and there's no reason in the world to take the second quarterback, the rookie quarterback, and wait for that change to expect them to be great. You can pick them up off the waiver wire. So unless you're in a super flex league or a 2-quarterback league, those guys won't get picked. And in those formats, you will see them get picked probably around the middle of the draft. I think you'd see Tyrod Taylor and Ryan Fitzpatrick go first. You'd see Tua go next. No one seems to really want Justin Herbert in a fantasy league, so you'll see him go way later on. But I don't think there's going to be anybody who even averages a top 12 finish in fantasy points among that foursome.
Would be interesting to see, though, if Tua healthy, Herbert, how many starts he gets. Both guys can run a little bit. If their rushing prowess maybe helps them as rookie quarterbacks, because as we know, they tend to 1-read, 2-read, take off, and maybe that helps some of their fantasy production once they do get on the field. Herbert definitely has better weapons than Tua does, so we'll see how those guys perform once they get on the field. I want to ask you guys about some strategy sessions, because people act don't know necessarily when to draft quarterbacks. We always say wait on quarterbacks, and so I want to put you guys in some scenarios about when to draft quarterbacks. So Heath, I'm going to make you the guy who has to take a quarterback first in every league. What's the strategy there? Is it definitely taking the guy in the first round, wait for the best value in round 2? How do you approach it if you're the guy that has to have a quarterback early?
Man, I hate being this guy because I'm not this guy. But I think the thing that I would say is if you have to take a quarterback early, you really need to probably take Patrick Mahomes or Lamar Jackson, because I don't think the difference between those two and everyone else is probably not going to be reflected in where they're drafted. If it's a league where quarterbacks get taken in the first and second round, then you're going to see Dak Prescott, Deshaun Watson, Kyler Murray, all those guys come off within the next round after Mahomes and Jackson go. So if I'm in one of those leagues where quarterbacks are going early and I definitely want to get one of the best quarterbacks, then I'm taking Mahomes or Jackson.
All right, Dave, you're the guy that's going to jump in on the quarterback run. So let's say the top 5 guys are gone, and we're talking about Mahomes, Jackson, Prescott, Wilson, Murray. I'll throw Deshaun Watson in there as well. Those guys are off the board, and you're starting to see maybe some other couple quarterbacks come off as well. How do you approach it then if you have to be a quarterback guy in the middle of the draft?
Well, it sounds to me like somebody who wants to get a good value on draft day, and you're going to wait for those elite level quarterbacks to go, and you're going to collect good players while other managers in your league are going to take the quarterbacks. I would try and get in on that run. So you're telling me that the top 5 are gone and then maybe a couple other ones after go. I'm still going to look for a quarterback that I've got ranked somewhere between 8th and 10th. And I think I can get away with getting one of those guys at least by round 7. That's probably the earliest, and maybe even round 9. And I love the strategy because I'm able to get great players at other positions first and still get a must-start quarterback in the middle rounds.
I know the guy that Ben is going to say in regard to this question, but Ben, you're the guy that's going to wait for quarterbacks. And I'm not talking about like our drafts where we're getting quarterbacks that we really love in round 10 or later. I'm talking about round 7, round 8, when the top 10, maybe 11 or 12 guys are off the board. We'll throw Rodgers into that conversation, maybe Joe Burrow and, some of those other guys. But what's your plan if you're waiting on a quarterback? Is there a guy that you just have to target and say when you see another quarterback in that same ranking range go off the board, that's when you jump in? Or just how do you approach it if you're waiting for quarterbacks on draft day?
Yeah, contrary to Heath, I like being in this position because this is how I like to draft. But regardless if it's round 7 or round 8 or what league you're in and how early quarterbacks go, when you're drafting late round quarterbacks, there's a couple of things that you definitely want to look at. You want to look at the downfield passing that I talked about. You want to know that there is passing upside. It's not just passing attempts, which is obviously also important. We want to know a pass-heavy offense, potentially a team that will trail, but a team that's willing to push the ball down the field. A guy like Derek Carr is not going to have that. He's just typically throwing underneath. But guys like Matthew Stafford, who you were referencing, will have that. And then the second thing you want to look at, you want rushing upside, right? That's how Josh Allen comes out of nowhere last year. That's where Lamar Jackson came from. And the downfield passing is a good example of how you could have identified Patrick Mahomes the year before. So those are the two things. I think Daniel Jones is a good option. We've talked a little bit about that, has some rushing upside and could push the ball down the field. Darius Slayton and those other weapons. But those are the elements that you really want to identify that will create that really high upside. And then if you don't hit on that huge upside, you're able to mix and match off the waiver wire. But when you're picking late, you really want to find a difference maker. And if not, you swing for the fences. If you don't find it, you have a chance to replace that guy.
Quarterback is one of the easiest positions to shoot for the fences, to shoot for upside, because if you do miss, there's probably going to be somebody off waivers that you could find. As we know, Ryan Tannehill last year won a lot of fantasy championships for many managers because he came on after replacing Marcus Mariota and was a fantasy star. So that's our quarterback conversation. When we come back, we're going to look at the tight end rankings for 2020. You know the guys at the top: George Kittle, Travis Kelce. But who should go first? We're going to tell you maybe a little switch in the rankings coming up next here on Fantasy Football Today. Welcome back to Fantasy Football Today. We're talking tight end rankings now for the 2020 season. Take a look at the consensus rankings that we have here. Again, these are the rankings for myself, Dave, and Heath. We're going to work in Ben Gretch's rankings as well. And as you see, no change at the top following last year. Travis Kelce, George Kittle, and Zach Ertz were the three guys we were talking about heading into 2019. They're the same three guys consensus-wise that we're talking about heading into 2020. See Andrews at 4, Waller at 5. Those guys were amazing last year. 6 through 10, some guys that we're hopeful for. And you see there at number 10, Rob Gronkowski. We don't know what to expect from Gronk coming out of retirement, joining the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. At least he is rejoining Tom Brady. So let's talk about the guys at the top. And Dave, give me the explanation for still Kelce over Kittle. We spent some time talking about some dynasty rankings last week, that Kittle is the better option in those formats, startup dynasty leagues, because he's younger and has the longer future. But for 2020, we're still all in on Kelce as the number one guy.
And for me, it's because of where he plays. I mean, Kelce and Kittle, they averaged nearly identical PPR points per game last year. But with Travis Kelce, you know his quarterback is Patrick Mahomes. You know the Chiefs' offense is going to throw the ball a lot. You know it's going to be difficult for defenses to key in on him. And that just makes him a little bit more reliable over the balance of a season than George Kittle, who's in a run-first offense in San Francisco. And the Niners added another receiver with a first-round pick in Brandon Ayuk. And Jimmy Garoppolo is good, but he's not Patrick Mahomes good. And he also got hurt a little bit last year. I don't know if you'd necessarily hold that against him. Now, you might say George Kittle's better because you can draft him maybe 10 picks later than Travis Kelce. But if I had to grab a tight end first in round 2, say it's 20th overall, where their value is good, I'm taking Kelce over Kittle.
So I said that the same three guys are at the top for us consensus-wise going into 2020. That's not the case for us individually. Heath, you're going with Mark Andrews over Zach Ertz as the number 3 tight end. Tell us why you like Andrews a little bit better than the guy who's been doing it year over year.
Yeah, last year was a real struggle for Zach Ertz before literally the entire Philadelphia Eagles wide receiving core got hurt. And they're coming back this year stronger. They are sure at least behaving as if they think Alshon Jeffrey is going to be ready for the start of the season. They drafted 4 wide receivers, including Jalen Reagor. They've got all types of options at receiver. The thing I like for them and don't like for Ertz is they have enough depth now where even if two guys, if Deshaun Jackson gets hurt and Alshon Jeffrey gets hurt, they've still got wide receivers. Dallas Goedert snuck up on a percentage of those tight end targets, and I don't think he's giving those away. So I would expect the total tight end targets for the Eagles to go down and Ertz's share to stay about the same, which means less opportunity for him. And unlike Kelce, he's not really been an elite guy on a per-target basis. Unlike Mark Andrews, he's not been an elite guy on a per-target basis. I think there's room for Andrews' role to grow as Baltimore throws more this year. Ertz's targets are going to shrink.
To be fair, the Ravens did add a couple of wide receivers as well in their draft class with Duvernay and Prochet, so that could add maybe to some targets. But I think what Dave said in regards to Kelce and Kittle, if you want to wait for a guy that could be better, you wait out Mark Andrews, you let somebody else take Zach Ertz in that round 3, round 4 range. Andrews going round 4, round 5. Better value for a guy, like he said, could be better. All right, Ben, give me a guy that's going to crack the top 4 this year. We saw Darren Waller have a great breakout season. We've seen Mark Andrews last year had a great breakout season. Kittle 2 years ago was that guy. Who's the guy that's going to crack the top 4 this year?
I think if Evan Ingram's healthy, he can easily finish that high. And there's going to be a little bit of concern about Ingram's potential target share because last year the Giants never had Sterling Shepard and Golden Tate and Darius Slayton and Saquon and Ingram all on the field for the same game. They were all missing time at one point or another. But I think Ingram is probably the best weapon of any of those guys, setting aside Saquon, but the best weapon in the passing game. Because of the way that he stresses defenses with his speed out of the tight end position, he is a very difficult cover. And I think with that type of wide receiver weaponry and the emergence of Slayton as a downfield threat, that should open up a lot of room for Ingram to operate underneath. He had a ton of targets when he was healthy last year. Again, the rest of the team wasn't healthy, but I think his target rate so far in his three-year career has been strong enough that I feel very confident about his upside if he can stay healthy for 16 games.
Yeah, man, that foot injury last year was a killer, and want to see how he does with Daniel Jones. Those two guys did not get a lot of time together on the field, and so we'll see how it all mixes together with all those receivers healthy. But Ingram certainly is a guy last year we were talking about as a top 5 guy. Maybe he does get into the top 4 this year. Number 5, like quarterback, we switched at number 5 at tight end. We're breaking apart as well a little bit here. So, Dave, your guy is Tyler Higbee at number 5. We saw him finish the season as an absolute monster last year. How's he going to do backing that up in 2020?
I would be surprised if the Rams didn't use him the same way in 2020 as they did late 2019. Goff's numbers were good, and it wasn't like he was taking advantage of a situation where Cooper Kupp was hurt or Robert Woods was hurt. Brandon Cooks was even on the field. He really wasn't doing much. Now he's off the team. Even Todd Gurley was playing, and Gurley had 4 games with 16-plus non-PPR points in those final 5. Here's my favorite stat about Tyler Higbee. He averaged 2.6 yards per route run over the course of the whole year. That's third best. That's right behind Kittle and Mark Andrews in terms of everybody at the tight end position in the National Football League. His final 5 games, he led all tight ends in fantasy points in PPR and non-PPR. And I just think he's going to develop into that short area best friend dump-off guy for Jared Goff. We know that Goff, when he's stressed from the pass rush, he has to get rid of the ball quick. And the pass rush is still going to come at him pretty quickly because that Rams offensive line is not fixed. You're going to see Tyler Higbee be a threat in the red zone. You're going to see him continue to get a lot of targets, including short targets, and you're going to see him finish as a top 5 fantasy tight end.
Ben, you don't necessarily feel the same way. You are the low guy on Tyler Higbee. I have him at 10. Why the disagreement with Dave?
Well, I mean, he was so good down the stretch, right? And we know that his target rate was very consistent, and he was very consistently productive down the stretch. But the big thing about that allowed that to happen, 2 big things. 1, Gerald Everett got banged up, and they've liked Gerald Everett. But 2 was that defenses were really making it hard on the Rams in their 11 personnel. And there was all that discussion about Patriots having kind of figured out the Rams offense the previous Super Bowl. And so Sean McVay had to adjust, right, in season. And I think the biggest thing we should expect now, yes, we have a shortened offseason, but we should expect McVay to not go into this season with just one kind of offensive structure that can be figured out. I think we should expect him to kind of switch things up and do things differently. So kind of in short, I think Higbee's role was so large because he was kind of pressed into duty, and it was kind of a need thing. And some of those matchups were great matchups for tight ends. I don't know that will carry over necessarily just from an offensive scheme standpoint into 2020.
And we'll see how the Rams work in a little bit more of Josh Reynolds, obviously adding Van Jefferson, losing Brandon Cooks, as Dave alluded to, but Cooks was banged up toward the end of last season. So we'll see how this all sort of works together. I like Higbee between both guys as the number 7 tight end. So very optimistic, just not as optimistic as Dave. Heath, you talked about the Eagles and Zach Ertz getting a lot of company. Darren Waller got a lot of company as well. Brian Edwards joining the team, Lynn Bowden joining the team. We know about the rest of the receivers that are there. What do you think about, obviously, Henry Ruggs as well? How can I leave him out? But you look at this Raiders offense now. How are those mouths going to impact, those other weapons going to impact Darren Waller?
Well, it kind of goes back to what Ben was saying. We can't really trust Sean McVay to not change his stripes because he's done so often. I have complete confidence in Derek Carr not changing his stripes. He's going to drop back 3 steps and get rid of the ball as quick as absolutely possible. And so I think Waller's targets will be relatively safe. Listen, it wasn't just a thing where they threw to Darren Waller because they didn't have anyone else and he just compiled numbers. He was extremely efficient on a per target basis. And I would expect that to continue. And he's not because he's getting targeted down the field, it's because he's breaking tackles. I think he's just a very good tight end that would have emerged earlier if not for some off-the-field issues. This is not a situation where he just had a fluky type year. And I also think that, again, the quarantine off-season may have something to do with this. How much are those rookies going to be ready to get into the game plan right away? In Philadelphia, there's a lot of company for Ertz, but 2 of those guys were on the team last year.
All right, let's stay with the quarantine theme and talk about Gronk. As you said, you're a little bit concerned about Brady picking up Bruce Arians' offense. What do you think about Gronk, Heath, with the new team coming out of retirement? How's he going to perform? Because everybody's excited that he's back. Is he going to be a great fantasy tight end in 2020?
I think Gronk shows you what's wrong with rankings because there's no place to put Rob Gronkowski in the rankings. If we're ranking based on upside, we should expect he has as much upside as any tight end in football. If we're ranking based on risk, he should be down with Jared Cook and Greg Olsen. And we don't have a great reason to have solid expectations for him in this year. And so I've just ranked him in the place where I don't feel great confidence in the tight ends anymore. I'll put him right there. He's a starter. He certainly has the upside to be a top 3 guy if somehow he played 16 games and was just the same guy after recuperating for a year. But there is significant risk that he misses games due to injury, which he often has, or that the connection just doesn't work as well in this offense when there's already Mike Evans and Chris Godwin there.
He's never shared the field with this much talent in the passing game, and he hasn't played 16 games since 2011. So a little bit cause for concern with Gronk, but again, it's exciting to have him back on the field. We'll see how he does as a 31-year-old player now in a new offense. When we come back, we're going to take a look at some of the number 2 tight ends that have number 1 potential. Some young guys, maybe like Jonnu Smith, Noah Fant, maybe an old guy like Jared Cook. We'll tell you about these fantasy options next here on Fantasy Football Today. Welcome back to Fantasy Football Today. We're talking tight end rankings for 2020, and you see here the list 11 through 20 of our consensus rankings. Some guys that hopefully still have some value. Austin Hooper, Jared Cook were very good last year. We'll see how they do this year. Hooper joining a new team in Cleveland. We have some young guys that hopefully will rise and take advantage of some better opportunities. Noah Fant, Jonnu Smith, Mike Gesicki, TJ Hawkinson, Ian Thomas, no more Greg Olsen, and Old Faithful, our buddy, our producer, Jack Capitordo, loves Eric Ebron, drafts him in every league no matter what, even now that he's with the Pittsburgh Steelers. I want to talk to the guys here about some strategy when looking at tight ends. And so, Heath, I'll start with you. Not necessarily the guys on this list, but the guys that we talked about 1 through 10. Tell me when's the right time to target Kelce or Kittle, especially if you're picking early in the rounds. We know at the end of round 1, you could probably take a shot on Kelce. Early round 2, same thing. But when you're trying to get one of those guys, what's the plan to get one of the elite tight ends?
Yeah, I'm perfectly fine taking Travis Kelce as early as the 10th pick in the draft. And I do think you will see Kittle a lot of times fall as late as pick 20, maybe even all the way down to the end of round 2. If he's there, it's way too easy. I'm just not going to pass on him. If you don't hit those 2 spots though, and let's say you've got the 2nd pick and you miss out on Kelce early, you're probably going to miss out on Kittle as well. I'm probably just waiting until the 5th round to take Mark Andrews.
All right, so the 5th round to take Mark Andrews. Dave, if you miss out on, let's say, Kelce, Kittle, Ertz, Andrews, Higbee for you, Waller for other guys, what's the strategy there if you're trying to get one of the 2nd tier, 3rd tier tight ends? How do you approach it?
I'm waiting until round 9 at the absolute earliest, and then I might take 2, Jamie, because it's good currency in fantasy to have a tight end with some upside. We saw it last year with people who took Darren Waller with a late round pick. He ended up being great. People could have taken him with another tight end earlier and then traded Waller to help their team in another way. Or they traded the tight end they took earlier and they had Waller as their starter. I'm always on the hunt for those late round tight ends. I think there's great value there this year. Probably about 5 or 6 names that have the potential to be not quite what Darren Waller was last year. That was a little bit of an abnormality, but still someone with top 12 potential.
Ben, give me a quick answer on, do you need to draft 2 tight ends this year? I know Mike Gesicki, somebody that you like. Dallas Goedert we saw last year was good. Again, some of these other names, Fant, Hawkinson. Tell me about the possibility of carrying 2 tight ends on your roster.
I don't think it's necessary because I think it's a deep position right now with a lot of upside options. I don't disagree with Dave that you can target 2 upside options and hope that you hit one big one. And I've been doing that in a lot of our drafts, kind of just waiting towards the late rounds. And yeah, Gesicki's my favorite late round option. And I think you can get by with just one because there are going to be plenty on the waiver wire with how deep the position is at the back end.
Yes, and you're going to see guys, that fall into this category. Again, Jonnu Smith, Ian Thomas, Jay Sternberger, maybe somebody, Blake Jarwin maybe as well. So a lot of good late-round tight ends. Fun conversation about tight ends and quarterbacks here, guys, as well as our Marshawn Lynch and Frank Gore conversation. You can hear more of us with our Fantasy Football Today podcast. Download that wherever podcasts are found. For Dave, for Heath, and for Ben Gretsch, thank you for watching Fantasy Football Today. We appreciate it. Want more of the Fantasy Football Today podcast and nonstop year-round fantasy advice? It's simple. Hit the subscribe button and hang with us all throughout the year.